Hey guys, it's VillainTheory, and today we're talking all about global logistics as part of my underrated card series. And I think there'll be two camps of people here. On one hand, there will be people saying, how is this card underrated? I love this card. This card is super powerful. I'm in that camp. But then I think there's a lot of people who kind of have written this card off, who just never use it, who don't even think about it. And people will be like, this card's good. And I think this card is really good. I think it's good in multiplayer. I think it's particularly good in two-player, but I think it's at its best in solo play, where I think it's a complete juggernaut, and people might be thinking, so what? It just moves cards around, but I think this card has so much potential, and I use it a lot. So it's a zero-cost event, and it has an additional cost to exhaust a shield card you control as part of its action. And once you've done that, you get to look at the top 4 cards of a player deck or an encounter deck. Then you get to discard any number of those and put them at the top or bottom of the deck in any order. And being able to put cards in a certain order when they would otherwise be random, particularly in the encounter deck, is very, very strong, and we're going to talk about that through most of the episode. But the other use is, of course, to target a player deck, and there are a few uses for this, and it can be very fun. We have a lot of the blasting cards like Repulsor Blast and Karmic Blast. We also got Domino, who loves to change what kind of cards she's going to get next. You can set up a bunch of wilds, so her pistols are, absolutely destroying the enemy. But for the most part, while I think it's fun to affect a player deck, I think this is by far the least powerful way to use this card. The most powerful way, I think, is to mess with the encounter deck, to know what your boost and or encounter cards are going to be. And when you take control of the villain phase, everything kind of falls in your favor. But before we get there, I think the biggest reason this card doesn't see a lot of use is because it has a rival. It has a rival as part of the shield package, and that is Homeland Intervention. And Homeland Intervention is a great card, and I can see why people are drawn to it. Zero cost, really good, and it can remove up to 6 threat. Zero cost card, 6 threat removal is very hard to turn down. But I think it has some kind of hidden costs, and that's not to say it's not a good card, because Homeland Intervention is a very, very good card. I love Homeland Intervention, but exhausting 3 cards, whereas Global Logistics only wants to exhaust 1, you need to get 3 other cards on the board before Homeland is at full strength, and then when you do exhaust them to use Homeland Intervention, you cannot use those cards. Now, maybe you weren't going to use them that turn anyway, but you're having cards on the board that you're not using regularly. Do you need them in your deck? What is that getting you? You're putting 3 kind of suboptimal cards in, so you can use 1 very optimal card. It's kind of a bit of a trade-off, especially if it's something like, Government Liaison, which could be generating a resource if you didn't exhaust it. Field Agent, that could be, stopping one of your allies taking damage, so you can use that ally, or even an ally that, again, you could be using. And again, you can save them, and conserving their uses can be powerful in things with limited uses, but I'm pretty sure everyone here who's played with Homeland Intervention a lot has ended up with a board with tons of counters they haven't used on sort of temporary kind of cards, and it's not terrible. I still think it's a good strategy and a good card, but it's definitely got some hidden costs. You're not really paying 0 cost every time you use it, and you can extend that to Global Logistics. You're not really paying 0 there if you're exhausting 1 card, even if it's, just 1 card. It's less of an investment, less of a quote-unquote loss, but nonetheless, Global Logistics has a much easier kind of target to hit. And whereas I think 6 threat removal, Homeland Intervention, that's really obvious gain, Global Logistics gain isn't obvious. So, long story short, love, love, love Homeland Intervention. Really think Global Logistics can keep up in solo play and maybe exceed it in a lot of cases. I think this card is phenomenal. And the biggest use, like I say, is I want to look at the encounter deck. I want to see 4 cards, move them about, set up the perfect boost and encounter card for myself compared to whatever it randomly was before, and then profit that way. And that has a lot of ways to benefit, but some of the most obvious we can see if we look at the standard set. So Shadow of the Past in advance, you might think, oh, I've just cherry-picked these cards, but if you play Global Logistics 3 times in a game, you're seeing like 12 different cards. You've got a pretty good chance to see one of these at least once, and I've used this card a lot. Quite often, Advance will be my encounter card, and I'll just be like, no, I'll move that and put that in the place where it's going to be my boost card. And having Advance become a boost card instead of an encounter card just feels like cheating, and that's kind of what it is, I guess. Global Logistics, being shield, being part of the spy kind of theme, you are just arranging things behind the scenes to work in your favor. So now, instead of being scared of flipping to Alter Ego in case the villain schemes the second time from an advance encounter card and you lose the game, now you know advance is not your encounter card, and now the villain is scheming once just for the minimum amount possible, which is insanely good. If Shadow of the Past is your encounter card and you just nudge that about so it isn't your encounter card anymore, that is also insanely, insanely good. And yes, I would cherry pick these 2 a little bit, but you will find encounter cards vary in severity in every kind of modular set, in every villain set. They are just, some will add just a tough card or heal the villain for 2 health or something ridiculous, and that's kind of like half an encounter card at best. Whereas other encounter cards create more encounter cards coming into play. Surge is a thing, and there are various, cards that say, when defeated, get another encounter card, or discard until you find another minion, or bring in a side scheme, or side schemes that bring in minions. And not all encounter cards are created equal. Usually when you use global logistics, there's always a way you can arrange things for the better, but some of the more extreme examples would be Fanaticism and Advanced Glider from Ronin and Venom Goblin respectively, but also the Expert and Standard 2 cards. If you're playing with Expert 2 and solo play, you are gonna absolutely love global logistics, especially on villains like Magog, who have a very small encounter set that you can go through a couple times quickly. You are gonna wanna try and make sure those Expert 2 encounter cards are not coming out basically as encounter cards definitely, but also look at the boost effect on Cruel Intentions as well. This card is scary. So global logistics is just so valuable. But then we've even got more sort of casual or more subtle, I would say, ways to gain from it. If I'm playing a character with tons of damage but not a lot of threat removal, and yes, I could build more into Justice, but why would I need to if I can look at the encounter deck and then take a minion as my encounter card instead? And hey, maybe I'm War Machine, I've got tons of damage for that. Yeah, I'd much rather see a minion than a side scheme. But maybe I'm Rocket, Valkyrie, or Thor, and I'll get, card draw, or just really have expertise in defeating minions. And yeah, I'd rather see a minion. You can kind of tailor your encounter card to your character, to your deck, to the board state and how things are going. And all of this combined means you kind of need to know how bad every encounter card is. You need to kind of work out really how difficult they are to deal with, how it interacts with your hero and your deck. It's not a card, I would say, for new players. At least they will not get optimal value out of it. But the more you play the game, I think the more valuable global logistics gets. The harder the villains you start to fight and encounter sets and mod sets you're using, then again, the more valuable global logistics becomes. And I think that's really very, very good. And like I said about Rocket and Thor and Valkyrie, certain heroes can use it in different ways to others. One of my favorites is Star-Lord. He gets encounter cards when he uses his What Could Go Wrong ability. Global Logistics lets you scout out the encounter deck, and you can make a tactical decision whether to use it. And because you are using Global Logistics to mess around with the encounter deck, normally you can make it safe to use, which is really fun. I've got a deck for that on Marvel CDB called Encounter Cards, I Choose You, and I will put a link to that in the description if I remember. And then we've got characters like Cyclops, and Cyclops with Tactical Brilliance can choose a tactic card from his discard pile, add it to his hand. That means you can Global Logistics more than your average hero. And yes, Cyclops might prefer to build into X-Men than S.H.I.E.L.D., but why not build into both? That is something he can definitely do, because something that sets global logistics aside from Homeland Intervention, although, by the way, you can just run both together, no problem. Something you can do with global logistics, which is very hard to do with Homeland Intervention, is you can just run a few key shield cards to make sure you've got one in play to resource for global logistics, and then do something completely different with the rest of your deck. And what I like to run with global logistics is roughly 5 shield cards. I could do 4, especially on a character with lots of card draw. I could go higher than that, especially if the other shield cards have good synergy. And again, you can just build 4 shield. But I normally have Monica Chang and 2 surveillance teams, sometimes 3, but the reason I don't always have 3 is because Surveillance Team is a low impact card, and let's say the villain has a very scary turn, I haven't managed to play Global Logistics, and now my board state is terrible, there's a Hazard Icon side scheme, there's a villainous minion in play, and I need a solution. If my hand is just full of really slow cards that don't do much, or do a tiny bit every single turn, like Surveillance Team could be half my hand to pay for it, and then I've just got 1 threat removal, that isn't good. So I quite often could just go for 2, but sometimes 3. It will depend on the deck. Mockingbird, Quake, these are just really good cards. Monica Chang with Surveillance Team, so good. Sometimes I'll swap in Agent Coulson. Sometimes, like I say, another Surveillance Team. But really, 5 shield cards, 3 copies of Global Logistics as well, and you are really set for success. You can then build into other things that support your hero or your game plan and push you toward victory. And there is one final thing I need to talk about Global Logistics, because yes, turning a bad encounter card into a weak boost card or just discarding it outright, that is very strong. You can kind of go very mechanical, very, calculating and say, this card will cost me X amount of resources to deal with, this one would cost me less, let's move it to that one, so on and so forth. But dodging loss conditions is also, like we said, making sure advance doesn't hit our encounter card is another very powerful benefit. But there is also the fact that you are armed with knowledge. There is no longer uncertainty going into the villain phase, at least in solo play, where you can affect 4 encounter cards and you get 2 per round. 1 as a boost, 1 as an encounter card. And being armed with that knowledge of what is coming up, mostly in solo and 2-player, is so good. If I know what my encounter card is going to be, and let's say it's going to be a minion, I'm not going to have to worry about getting, let's say, a high fort minion onto the board this turn. maybe if I know no extra attack is coming up, I can be a little bit riskier, get a different upgrade out that's going to give me huge value for the rest of the game. It's hard to quantify this in any kind of, mathematic way that I know of at least, but the way you can use knowledge to alter what you're doing is just so incredibly, incredibly good. And you could kind of look at it almost like card draw. You want to use card draw first in most scenarios, in most situations, to know what to do with the rest of your turn. Because if you draw one card, and we've all been there, we get one card and like, oh, my entire plan has just been changed because now I want to play this new card I've got. We always do card draw first. With global logistics in hand, we do global logistics second after any card draw, I would say. And now you know what is coming up in the encounter phase, and you're going to know how best to play the hand that you have. And it just arms you with so much information. I think it's so on theme for Shield, messing around, being spies, getting information. I just love this card, and I think it's incredibly good. So that about does it for the video. You can assume control, plan ahead, you've got confidence in everything that is going on, you're not going to be surprised by the villain, and you cruise for the villain phase in most circumstances with this card. If you're looking at 4 encounter cards, and again, this is particularly in solo, you can pick from 4 encounter cards to be your encounter card instead of just the 1, pick something weak, and then when it comes around to the next hero phase, the board's probably looking in a pretty good state or something you can deal with easily, and then you can start to push toward the win condition. So it's just such a good card. And yeah, that about does it. Probably my favorite Justice card. I might need to double check that, and maybe we'll do a video on some of my favorite cards sometime. But yeah, huge, huge fan of Global Logistics. And yeah, that about does it. So thank you so much for watching. If you haven't already, please exhaust that subscribe button. And if you're interested, we also have a Discord server for the channel, link down in the description. Thanks so much. Catch you next time.